When Captain Sarah Mitchell stepped into the cockpit of the F-35 Lightning II that Tuesday morning, she had no idea she was about to become a legend. The senior officers watching from the control tower expected to witness a routine training exercise designed to humble an overconfident pilot.
What they got instead was a display of skill so extraordinary that it would rewrite the rules of aerial combat training and shatter every assumption about what was possible in the world's most advanced fighter jet. This is the true story of how one woman turned what was meant to be her downfall into the most talked-about flight in modern military aviation history.
Captain Sarah Mitchell had always been different from the other pilots at Edwards Air Force Base. While her colleagues spent their evenings at the officers' club swapping war stories and bragging about their latest missions, Sarah could usually be found in the base library, nose deep in technical manuals and flight simulation data. At 28, she had already logged more hours in advanced fighter aircraft than pilots 10 years her senior, but this dedication to perfection had earned her as many enemies as admirers. The trouble started 3 months earlier during a routine briefing about the F-35 Lightning II program. Sarah had been sitting in the back of the auditorium when Colonel James Harrison, the base commander, began explaining the limitations of the aircraft's stealth capabilities in certain weather conditions. Without raising her hand or waiting for permission to speak, Sarah had stood up and politely corrected the colonel's assessment, citing recent classified test data that contradicted his presentation. The room had fallen silent. Junior officers simply did not correct their commanding officers in public, especially not with the confidence and technical precision that Sarah had displayed. Colonel Harrison's face had turned red, but he couldn't argue with her facts. The data she referenced was accurate, and her analysis was flawless.
However, being right and being smart about how you expressed that rightness were two very different things in the military.
From that moment, Sarah became a marked woman.
The old guard at Edwards saw her as a threat to the established order, a young upstart who needed to be taught her place. They whispered about her in the corridors, questioning whether someone so young could really understand the complexities of modern aerial warfare. Some even suggested that her rapid advancement through the ranks had more to do with the military's push for diversity than her actual skills as a pilot. Sarah was painfully aware of the whispers and the sideways glances. She had grown up in a small town in Ohio where her father worked as a mechanic at the local airport. From the age of 5, she had been fascinated by aircraft, spending countless hours watching planes take off and land while her father explained the intricacies of flight mechanics. By the time she was 12, she could disassemble and rebuild a small aircraft engine from memory. Her teachers recognized her exceptional aptitude for mathematics and physics, but it was her intuitive understanding of aerodynamics that set her apart. When Sarah graduated valedictorian from high school, she had offers from several prestigious universities, including MIT and Stanford. Instead, she chose the Air Force Academy, driven by a burning desire to fly the most advanced aircraft in the world. Her 4 years at the academy were marked by academic excellence and an almost obsessive focus on flight training. She graduated at the top of her class and was immediately selected for the most competitive pilot training programs available. Her rise through the ranks had been meteoric. Within 5 years of graduation, she had become one of the youngest pilots ever qualified to fly the F-22 Raptor and later the F-35 Lightning II. Her instructors consistently rated her performance as exceptional, noting her ability to push aircraft to their absolute limits while maintaining perfect safety margins. But with each promotion and each glowing review, the resentment from her peers grew stronger. The breaking point came during a heated discussion about combat tactics in the base conference room. Sarah had been reviewing mission reports from recent overseas deployments when she noticed a pattern that troubled her. Several pilots had reported difficulty maintaining situational awareness during complex multi-threat scenarios while flying the F-35. Sarah believed the problem wasn't with the pilots but with how they were being trained to use the aircraft's advanced sensor systems. She had spent weeks developing a new training protocol that would better integrate the F-35's cutting-edge technology with human decision-making processes. When she finally presented her findings to the command staff, the response was mixed. Some younger officers were intrigued by her innovative approach, but the senior leadership saw it as criticism of their existing training methods. Colonel Harrison was particularly offended by Sarah's suggestion that the current training protocols were inadequate. He had personally overseen the development of many of these protocols and took her critique as a personal attack on his competence. After the meeting, he pulled Sarah aside and made it clear that her know-it-all attitude was becoming a problem that needed to be addressed. The setup began to take shape 2 weeks later. Colonel Harrison and several other senior officers developed what they claimed was a special training exercise designed to test the limits of the F-35's capabilities in extreme scenarios.
They selected Sarah as the test pilot ostensibly because of her expertise with the aircraft, but their real motivation was to create a situation where she would fail spectacularly and publicly. The exercise was designed to be nearly impossible.
Sarah would be required to navigate a complex series of simulated threats while maintaining radio silence and operating under severe weather conditions. The scenario included multiple surface-to-air missile sites, enemy fighter aircraft, and electronic warfare systems designed to interfere with the F-35's advanced sensor suite. To make matters worse, she would be flying with a reduced fuel load, forcing her to complete the mission quickly and efficiently. What the senior officers didn't know was that Sarah had been anticipating something like this for weeks.
The growing hostility from the command structure hadn't gone unnoticed, and she had been preparing for the possibility that they might try to sabotage her career. She had spent countless hours in the flight simulator running increasingly complex scenarios and pushing herself to the absolute limits of what was possible in the F-35.
Sarah also had an advantage that her would-be saboteurs didn't know about. During her off-duty hours, she had been working with Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the civilian contractor who specialized in human-machine interface design. Dr. Rodriguez had been quietly developing modifications to the F-35's flight control systems that could dramatically improve pilot performance in high-stress situations. These modifications hadn't been officially approved for testing, but Sarah had convinced Dr. Rodriguez to install them on her aircraft during routine maintenance. The night before the exercise, Sarah barely slept.
She reviewed every aspect of the mission profile, memorizing the locations of threats and planning multiple contingency routes through the simulated battlefield.
She knew that the odds were stacked against her, but she also knew that failure wasn't an option. Her entire career, everything she had worked for since childhood, was riding on her performance the next morning. As dawn broke over Edwards Air Force Base, Sarah made her way to the flight line with a mixture of determination and nervous energy coursing through her veins. The F-35 Lightning II sat on the tarmac like a predator waiting to strike, its angular stealth design cutting a distinctive silhouette against the desert sky. Ground crew members were making final preparations, checking systems and loading the aircraft with the sensors and equipment needed for the exercise. Colonel Harrison and several other senior officers were gathered in the control tower watching her preparations with barely concealed anticipation. They expected to see her struggle with the impossible mission parameters they had designed. Some had even prepared statements explaining how the exercise demonstrated the need for more experienced pilots in critical assignments. Sarah completed her pre-flight inspection with characteristic thoroughness, checking every system and control surface with the methodical precision that had become her trademark. The ground crew chief, Master Sergeant Williams, approached her as she finished her walk-around inspection. Williams had been working with military aircraft for over 20 years, and he had developed a keen sense for when something unusual was happening. "Captain," he said quietly, "I don't know what kind of mission they've got you running today, but I've never seen the brass this interested in a training exercise. They've got cameras set up in the tower and everything." Sarah nodded grimly. She had suspected that her humiliation was meant to be documented for posterity. "Thanks for the heads up, Sergeant. I appreciate you keeping my bird in top condition." Williams studied her face for a moment. Despite her youth, there was something in Sarah's eyes that reminded him of the veteran combat pilots he had worked with overseas. "You be careful up there, Captain. Something about this whole thing doesn't smell right to me." As Sarah climbed into the cockpit and began running through her startup procedures, she could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on her. The advanced displays and controls of the F-35 came to life around her, creating a cocoon of technology that would either be her salvation or her downfall. She had trained for this moment her entire life, but she knew that everything she had accomplished so far would mean nothing if she failed to prove herself in the next 2 hours. The tower cleared her for takeoff and Sarah advanced the throttles. The F-35's powerful engine responded instantly, pushing her back into her seat as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. As the main landing gear lifted off the tarmac, she realized there was no turning back. The next chapter of her career, and possibly her life, was about to begin. As the F-35 climbed through 15,000 feet, Sarah felt the familiar rush of adrenaline that came with flying the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. But today was different. Today she could feel the hostile eyes watching her from the control tower below, waiting for her to make a mistake that would justify their doubts about her abilities. The first phase of the exercise began 30 miles northeast of Edwards, where Sarah encountered her first simulated threat,
Her heads-up display suddenly filled with warning indicators as multiple surface-to-air missile sites activated their targeting radars. According to the mission parameters, she was supposed to identify and avoid these threats, while maintaining a specific flight path toward her primary objective. Most pilots would have immediately climbed to a higher altitude or altered course to avoid the simulated missiles. Instead, Sarah did something unexpected. She pushed the F-35 into a steep dive, dropping to less than 500 feet above the desert floor. At this altitude, the aircraft's radar signature became virtually undetectable against the ground clutter, effectively making her invisible to the simulated missile sites. The maneuver was technically within mission parameters, but it required flying at dangerously low altitudes and terrain that offered no margin for error.
In the control tower, Colonel Harrison watched Sarah's altitude readings with growing alarm.
"What the hell is she doing?" he muttered to his aide. "She's flying nap of the earth in an F-35. That's not how you operate a stealth fighter." Major Thompson, the exercise coordinator, checked his instruments twice before responding. "Sir, she's completely disappeared from the simulated SAM radars. According to our sensors, she's effectively invisible to ground-based threats." This wasn't how the exercise was supposed to unfold. Sarah was meant to struggle with the multiple threat environment, perhaps taking simulated damage that would force her to abort the mission early. Instead, she had found a creative solution that the exercise designers hadn't anticipated. Sarah's unconventional approach to the first phase was just the beginning. As she approached the second threat zone, her aircraft's electronic warfare systems detected multiple enemy fighter aircraft converging on her position. The scenario called for 4 F-16s to intercept her, forcing her into a defensive posture that would consume precious fuel and time. But Sarah had studied the flight patterns of the opposing aircraft during her mission preparation. She knew exactly when and where they would appear, and she had identified a weakness in their coordination that she could exploit. Instead of waiting for the F-16s to find her, she climbed rapidly to 30,000 feet and positioned herself above their expected flight path. When the first F-16 appeared on her sensors, Sarah was already in position for what fighter pilots call a high-side gun pass. She rolled inverted and dove toward the simulated enemy aircraft, using the F-35's superior energy management to execute a textbook intercept. In a real combat situation, the F-16 pilot would never have seen her coming. The exercise controllers were forced to declare the first opposing fighter as shot down by Sarah's simulated weapons. This wasn't supposed to happen. The F-16s were meant to force her into a prolonged engagement that would drain her fuel and compromise her ability to complete the primary mission. Captain Mark Stevens, one of the F-16 pilots participating in the exercise, couldn't believe what had just happened. He had been flying fighters for over 8 years, and he had never been defeated so quickly and decisively by another pilot. As he watched Sarah's F-35 disappear from his radar screen, he realized he had just witnessed something extraordinary. "Tower? This is Viper 2-1, Stevens radioed. "I need to confirm my status in this exercise. Did I just get shot down by Captain Mitchell?" The response from the tower was delayed, as the controllers struggled to understand what they were witnessing. "Viper 2-1, that's affirmative. You are declared destroyed. Return to base." Stevens shook his head in amazement as he turned his F-16 toward Edwards. In the post-mission briefing, he would tell his colleagues that he had never seen anyone fly an F-35 with such aggressive precision. Sarah hadn't just defeated him. She had done it using tactics that seemed to redefine what was possible in the Lightning II. The remaining 3 F-16s tried to coordinate their approach more carefully, but Sarah had already anticipated their next move. She used the F-35's advanced sensor fusion capabilities to track all 3 aircraft simultaneously while remaining virtually invisible to their radar systems. When they finally found her, she was in a position where she could engage them individually, defeating each one before they could provide mutual support to their wingmen. In less than 20 minutes, Sarah had single-handedly defeated 4 experienced fighter pilots in a scenario designed to overwhelm her with superior numbers. The exercise controllers were forced to move immediately to the final phase, hoping that the ground attack portion of the mission would finally provide the failure they were expecting. The final objective required Sarah to penetrate a heavily defended target area and deliver simulated weapons against a high-value target. The target was protected by multiple layers of simulated air defenses, including advanced surface-to-air missile systems and electronic warfare equipment designed to interfere with the F-35 sensors and navigation systems. Most pilots would have approached this phase of the mission cautiously, using the F-35's stealth capabilities to avoid detection while carefully planning their attack route. Sarah had a different idea. She had been studying the electromagnetic signatures of the simulated defense systems, and she believed she could use the F-35's electronic warfare capabilities
in a way that had never been attempted before. Instead of avoiding the enemy electronic warfare systems, Sarah flew directly toward them. This seemed like suicide to the observers in the control tower, who watched in disbelief as her aircraft headed straight into the most heavily defended airspace in the exercise. What happened next would be discussed in classified military circles for years to come.
Sarah had discovered that by carefully modulating the F-35's own electronic warfare transmissions, she could create a form of electronic camouflage that not only protected her aircraft from enemy radar but actually used the enemy's own defensive systems against them. The technique required precise timing and an intuitive understanding of electromagnetic physics that few pilots possessed.
Sarah had to manually adjust dozens of parameters in real time while flying at high speed through hostile airspace. One mistake would have resulted in immediate detection and simulated destruction. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, monitoring the exercise from a classified location on the base, watched her unofficial modifications to the F-35 systems perform beyond her wildest expectations. The human-machine interface improvements she had developed allowed Sarah to process and respond to information at a rate that seemed almost superhuman. She's not just flying that aircraft, Dr. Cumpry, Rodriguez whispered to herself. She's thinking with it. Sarah's approach to the target was unlike anything anyone had ever seen. She used the electronic warfare environment as a form of three-dimensional terrain, navigating through gaps in the electromagnetic coverage with the same precision that a traditional pilot might use to fly through a canyon. The simulated defense systems couldn't track her because she was hiding in their own blind spots, using their electronic emissions as a form of camouflage. When she finally reached the target area, Sarah delivered her simulated weapons with surgical precision. The exercise computers calculated that her attack would have destroyed the primary target and two secondary objectives that weren't even part of the original mission parameters. She had exceeded the minimum requirements by such a wide margin that the scoring system couldn't properly evaluate her performance. As Sarah began her return flight to Edwards, the control tower was in chaos. Colonel Harrison was demanding explanations from his staff, while the exercise controllers were frantically reviewing their data to understand what had just happened. The mission that was supposed to humble an overconfident pilot had instead produced the highest-scoring individual performance in the history of the F-35 training program.
Major Thompson was reviewing telemetry data when he made a discovery that would change everything.
"Sir," he said to Colonel Harrison, "I think you need to see this. According to our instruments, Captain Mitchell's aircraft is operating with performance parameters that are significantly different from standard F-35 specifications." The implication was clear. Sarah hadn't just outflown her opposition. She had done it using a modified aircraft that incorporated experimental technology. The question was whether these modifications were authorized, and if not, how she had managed to install them without detection. As Sarah approached Edwards for landing, she knew that her performance had exceeded even her own expectations. The experimental modifications had worked perfectly, allowing her to push the F-35 to capabilities that its designers had never imagined. But she also knew that her unauthorized use of unproven technology would create complications that might overshadow her accomplishments. The landing was flawless. As expected, Sarah taxied to her assigned parking area and began shutting down the aircraft's systems, her mind already racing ahead to the inevitable debriefing that would follow. She had proven her point about the F-35's untapped potential, but she had also revealed her willingness to bend rules in pursuit of that proof. As the canopy opened and Sarah climbed out of the cockpit, she could see Colonel Harrison and several other senior officers approaching across the flight line. Their expressions were unreadable, a mixture of amazement, confusion, and barely controlled anger. She had given them a performance they would never forget, but she had also created a situation that would force them to confront the limitations of their own understanding of modern aerial warfare. The next few hours would determine whether Sarah's extraordinary flight would be remembered as a breakthrough in military aviation or as the end of a promising career. Colonel Harrison reached Sarah's aircraft just as the ground crew was securing the F-35 for post-flight inspection. His face was a mask of controlled fury, but beneath that anger, Sarah could see something else, genuine confusion about what he had just witnessed. "Captain Mitchell," he said, his voice carefully measured, "I need you to accompany me to the debriefing room immediately. We have some questions about your performance today." Sarah nodded and fell into step beside the colonel, knowing that this conversation would determine the trajectory of her entire career. Behind them, a team of technical specialists was already beginning their examination of her aircraft, searching for evidence of the modifications that had enabled her extraordinary performance. The debriefing room was packed with more senior officers than Sarah had ever seen in one place. Besides Colonel Harrison, there were representatives from the Pentagon's F-35 program office, the Air Force Test Center, and even some civilian contractors she didn't recognize.
The atmosphere was tense, electric with the energy of people trying to understand something that shouldn't have been possible.
General Patricia Dawson, the overall commander of Air Force Material Command, was seated at the head of the conference table. She was a legend in military aviation circles, one of the first women to fly combat missions and a former test pilot who had helped develop some of the Air Force's most advanced aircraft. Her presence at the debriefing meant that Sarah's flight had attracted attention at the highest levels of military leadership.
Captain Mitchell, General Dawson began. What we witnessed today was either the most exceptional display of piloting skill in recent memory, or a dangerous deviation from established safety protocols using unauthorized equipment modifications. We need to understand exactly what happened up there.
Sarah took a deep breath before responding.
She had prepared for this moment during the flight back to base, knowing that honesty was her only viable strategy.
General, I used experimental modifications to the F-35's human-machine interface systems that were developed by Dr. Elena Rodriguez under a classified research contract. These modifications were installed during routine maintenance without official authorization. The room erupted in whispers and heated exchanges.
Colonel Harrison's face darkened as he realized that Sarah had been operating a modified aircraft without his knowledge or permission. From a regulatory standpoint, this was a serious violation that could result in court-martial proceedings.
But General Dawson raised her hand for silence, her expression thoughtful rather than angry.
Dr. Crossamer Rodriguez, she said, turning to address the civilian contractor who had been quietly observing from the back of the room, please explain the nature of these modifications and their potential impact on aircraft safety. Dr. Rodriguez stood nervously, clearly uncomfortable with the attention focused on her.
General, the modifications involve enhancements to the pilot vehicle interface that allow for more intuitive control of the F-35's complex sensor and weapon systems.
The safety margins were extensively tested in simulation, and all modifications include automatic safeguards that prevent the pilot from exceeding the aircraft's structural limitations. And these modifications have not been approved for operational testing? General Dawson asked.
No, ma'am. The formal approval process can take years, and we believe that limited testing under controlled conditions would help refine the technology before submitting it for official review.
Colonel Harrison could no longer contain his frustration. General, this is exactly the kind of cowboy behavior that I've been warning about.
Captain Mitchell has consistently shown a disregard for proper procedures and chain of command. Today's unauthorized use of experimental technology could have resulted in the loss of a $100 million aircraft and the death of a pilot. Sarah felt her temper flare at the colonel's characterization of her actions. Sir, with all due respect, the modifications were thoroughly tested and included multiple safety redundancies.
The performance improvements they enabled are exactly what our pilots need to maximize the F-35's potential in real combat situations. That's not your decision to make, Captain.
We have procedures for testing new technology precisely because unauthorized experimentation is dangerous and irresponsible. General Dawson studied the data displays that showed Sarah's flight path and performance metrics. The numbers were unprecedented. Sarah had completed a mission designed to be nearly impossible, and she had done it with a margin of success that exceeded anything in the historical record. Colonel Harrison, General Dawson said finally, while I understand your concerns about proper procedures, we cannot ignore the results that Captain Mitchell achieved today.
Her performance suggests capabilities that could revolutionize how we employ the F-35 in combat situations. She turned to address the room more broadly. The question before us is not whether Captain Mitchell violated protocols. She clearly did. The question is whether her actions revealed tactical capabilities that are worth developing further, despite the irregular manner in which they were discovered.
Major General Robert Chen, representing the Pentagon's F-35 program office, leaned forward in his chair. General Dawson, we've been looking for ways to improve pilot effectiveness in the Lightning II for years. The multi-threat scenarios that Captain Mitchell navigated today are exactly the kind of complex combat environment our pilots will face in future conflicts. Sarah watched the discussion unfold around her, realizing that her unauthorized test flight had inadvertently triggered a high-level debate about the future of fighter pilot training and aircraft development. The senior officers in the room were no longer focused on punishing her. They were trying to understand the implications of what she had accomplished. Rodriguez was asked to provide a detailed technical briefing about her modifications. As she explained the science behind the enhanced human-machine interface, it became clear that her work represented a significant breakthrough in aviation technology. The modifications didn't just make the F-35 easier to fly, they actually expanded the pilot's cognitive capacity to process and respond to complex tactical situations. The key insight, Dr.
Rodriguez explained, was recognizing that the F-35's advanced sensors and computing systems can actually overwhelm human decision-making processes. By creating more intuitive interfaces and providing better information prioritization, we can help pilots utilize the aircraft's full potential without experiencing cognitive overload.
General Dawson asked the question that everyone in the room was thinking. Dr. Rodriguez, in your professional opinion, could these modifications be safely implemented across the entire F-35 fleet? With proper testing and refinement, absolutely, Dr. F. Rodriguez replied. Captain Mitchell's performance today demonstrates that the core concepts are sound.
We would need several months of additional development and formal safety testing, but the potential benefits are enormous. The debriefing continued for over 3 hours. As various specialists analyzed every aspect of Sarah's flight,
the consensus that emerged was remarkable. Despite her violation of established procedures, Sarah had inadvertently conducted one of the most valuable test flights in the history of the F-35 program. Colonel Harrison found himself in an impossible position.
Military discipline demanded that Sarah face consequences for her unauthorized actions, but the potential value of her discoveries made punishment seem counterproductive. As the debriefing concluded, he realized that his attempt to humble an overconfident pilot had backfired spectacularly.
General Dawson made the final decision that would shape Sarah's future. Captain Mitchell, your unauthorized use of experimental technology was a serious breach of protocol that cannot be ignored. However, the tactical capabilities you demonstrated today are too valuable to dismiss. You will face a formal reprimand for your procedural violations. But you will also be assigned to lead a new project to develop and test these enhancements, under proper oversight.
The announcement sent shockwaves through the room. Instead of ending Sarah's career, her controversial flight had earned her a promotion to project lead for what would become one of the most important aviation development programs in recent history.
Colonel Harrison's expression was a mixture of disbelief and resignation.
His plan to destroy Sarah's reputation had instead elevated her to a position where she would have significant influence over the future of fighter pilot training. Over the following months, Sarah worked with Dr.
Rodriguez and a team of engineers to refine and improve the interface modifications. Formal testing confirmed that the enhancements could safely improve pilot performance by margins that seemed almost impossible.
The technology was eventually approved for fleet-wide implementation, revolutionizing how military pilots interacted with advanced aircraft systems. The story of Sarah's unauthorized test flight became legendary within military aviation circles, though the specific details remained classified for years.
Pilots who had initially resented her rapid advancement began to respect her willingness to push boundaries in pursuit of tactical excellence. Colonel Harrison was quietly reassigned to a Pentagon desk job, his career effectively ended by his failed attempt to sabotage a subordinate. He became a cautionary tale about the dangers of letting personal prejudice override professional judgment. Sarah's career flourished in ways that exceeded even her own ambitious expectations.
She was eventually promoted to full colonel and placed in charge of the Air Force's most advanced fighter pilot training programs. Her innovative approaches to human-machine interface design influenced not just military aviation but civilian aircraft development as well.
Years later, when asked about that pivotal flight at Edwards Air Force Base, Sarah would reflect on how a moment of career-threatening insubordination had transformed into the foundation of a new era in military aviation. She had proven that sometimes the greatest breakthroughs come from those willing to challenge conventional thinking, even when the personal cost might be enormous.
The F-35 Lightning II, enhanced with Sarah's interface modifications, became the most effective fighter aircraft in the world. Pilots trained using her methods consistently outperformed their predecessors in combat simulations and real-world operations.
What had begun as an attempt to destroy one woman's career had instead revolutionized an entire field of military technology.
Dr. Rodriguez continued her research into human-machine interfaces, eventually founding a company that applied similar principles to civilian aviation, medical devices, and industrial systems. Her collaboration with Sarah had opened up entirely new fields of scientific investigation. The lessons learned from Sarah's dramatic test flight extended far beyond military aviation. Her story became a case study in leadership schools about the importance of recognizing exceptional talent, even when it challenges established norms.
Organizations across various industries began to reevaluate how they handled innovative thinking and unconventional approaches to problem-solving. For Sarah herself, the experience taught her that true leadership sometimes requires taking calculated risks that others might view as reckless. She had gambled her entire career on a single flight, and that gamble had paid off in ways she could never have imagined. The F-35 that Sarah flew that day was eventually retired to a museum, where a plaque commemorates the flight that changed modern military aviation.
Visitors to the museum often ask tour guides about the young pilot who dared to rewrite the rules of aerial combat in the span of a single morning. Today, every pilot who flies an F-35 Lightning II benefits from the innovations that Sarah Mitchell and driver Elena Rodriguez pioneered during their unauthorized experiment. Their willingness to challenge conventional wisdom and push technological boundaries had created capabilities that continue to give military aviators decisive advantages in combat situations around the world. The story of Captain Sarah Mitchell's extraordinary test flight serves as a reminder that progress often comes from those brave enough to question established practices and pursue excellence, even when the path forward seems uncertain or dangerous.
Sometimes the most valuable discoveries emerge from moments when everything appears to be at risk.